All right, we're live, or well, I'm live anyways. Forge game. I'm still a hard man. Let's go. I am your host, Imperator of Forge, otherwise known as Forge Warhammer. I will be talking about American geostrategy. So, when we look at when we look in terms of what geostrategy is, I will begin by defining geostrategy. Geostrategy is the process in which a nation or a country exercises and anticipates its outreach, be it in its region, with its neighbors, the continent, regions, its hemisphere, and on the globe overall. So that is geostrategy. It could be an exercise of military feats, technological and scientific feats, innovation, military outreach, economic and naval outreach. Naval outreach has always been particularly important, especially because of the position of the seas, the global seas around the world. Powers that could control and were able to patrol and monitor and utilize the trade routes across oceans overwhelmingly had the dominant advantage in terms of global outreach and power because most of the earth is made of ocean or covered in ocean. That's a good example of what geostrategy is. Now, let's talk about America. The United States of America is in North America. It is the predominant, or at least until recently, has been the predominant superpower on the earth, pushing and maintaining its preponderant order on the globe with American imperialism and pushing its particular brand of imperialism and American brand capitalism or monopolistic capitalism that it has pushed around the world, especially into the developing world, Latin America, Africa, and South Asia, and so forth. So I think that's a good, fair breakdown of what I will be getting into and the topic I will be getting into today. So there are several major powers in the world of the 21st century. The third decade of the 21st century, the 2020s, because it is marked since the alleged birth of Jesus Christ. And I know that, most people who talk about chronology and the utilization of chronology and time don't really literally believe in the actual date of the birth of Christianity, but we're going to use that chronology. It is the predominant major chronology. So anyways, I will be talking about American geostrategy. It is important to note that there are quite a few major powers on the globe today. The United States has been, although it is now its position is being more contested, especially by China and India, about its position on the world global stage and position. And there are now, of course, other countries, usually aligned with BRICS, that are beginning to challenge the American petrodollar. So Some of these countries or some of these powers could be the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, China, India, Indonesia, potentially Saudi Arabia, Brazil. Turkey is starting to become a more important player in the world, as is South Korea and Japan. And the European Union is not its own country, but the European Union is a federation. It is more of a block of different countries. So those are examples. There's up and becoming powers in the world, but since the end of the Cold War in 1991, there has only been one paramount legacy superpower, which is the United States. And I want to talk about and go over American geostrategy. So America is an imperialist nation. It pushes and it intervenes and it invades either through direct military intervention and circumcision into other countries that are usually substantially weaker than it is, or it uses its economic logistics and its geostrategic logistics to influence and push a soft power influence onto other countries. A good example would be Taiwan, places like that. So anyways, what is the history of America's geostrategic rivalries? What exactly has America faced? The geopolitical commentator Peter Zeihan has mentioned that America, which is still a very young country, a very young nation, has not really had many rivalries, at least not since the early 19th century or the early 20th century, when the Europeans were pretty much forced out of the Western Hemisphere for good. They completely lost their influence after the Second World War. But anyways, I would say, so my opinion is that there have been generally about 5 geostrategic threats to the integrity and the internal borders and dimensions of the territorial integrity of the United States. What I mean by this is mainly the 48 states. Now, obviously, Alaska and Hawaii and American Samoa and the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico are obviously part of the United States territory, but I will generally be referring to the 48 states from Maine to Florida to California to Washington. And so I'll be mainly talking about that when I talk about the internal security and the internal and external security and externalized national threats to the United States. The United States has existed as a nation for about 250 years. Prior to that, it was a set of colonies, chiefly under the British or the English, for 150 years before that. And this is a relatively short and rather bleak time period in the history of humanity, in the history of empires, and the United States has set out on a very unique and rather branded course of imperialism or empire, nation, state, and empire building. There are aspects of the United States that makes it a nation state, as well as what makes it a universal empire. But in terms of historical contrasts, the United States of America would be very close to the Roman Republic of the 2nd and 1st century BC. It very much envelops and elapses with the late Roman Republic before it evolved into the Roman Empire. And in terms of its federation, its federational standing, it quite resembles the Delian League in the Delian League. It was chiefly centered and chartered by Athens. There's even some aspects of the Venetian Republic as well. So the United States, and this is important to point out, the United States has a federational republican structure. It is a federation of states, and it is chiefly a republic as opposed to a monarchy, and its republican structure and republican preponderance has had a very huge impact on how it emulates itself onto others. So the first chief national threat to the United States was the Kingdom of France in the early 18th, late 17th, early 18th centuries. The Kingdom of France had a gigantic proportion of land from Louisiana up to Quebec and Ontario, and this was known as Nouveau Français. And most of the American settlers were Protestants. A lot of them were Calvinists. A lot of them were Protestant dissidents that left the British Isles and settled in the various 13 colonies. They were overwhelmingly English-speaking, whereas the French were Roman Catholic and French-speaking and Romance, or had a Latin Romance culture. The American colonies had an Anglo-Saxon, Nordic, or a chiefly Germanic culture. They spoke English, and they were Northern European, and they were Protestant. And throughout a series and set of wars between the British and the French in North America, the British and the Americans under the British leadership successfully defeated and bested the French and their Indian allies like the Mohawks, the Mohawks, the Seminoles, the Mohicans, the Iroquois. I think the Iroquois sided with the French, but throughout a set of wars which culminated in the 7 Years' War and the Treaty of Paris, that entire vast area of land was ceded to the British Empire in 1762, 1763. So the French were, at least in its very early and the very formal days, even before America became a nation, was a geostrategic threat to what the United States would become. Now, the second major geostrategic threat to the United States was the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, or the British Empire, and sometimes it is referred to as England. Now, this is an interesting particularity because, at least in the 18th century, the Americans and the British largely hailed from the same stock of, or same people. They had the same religion and the same language. And because of an ideological breach that began with the Puritans, who came from the east of England and settled in New England, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and so forth, that became a chief center of very strong dissent, very strong dissension against the monarchy, very strong dissension against the crown and against Parliament. And the colonies already had assemblies and points of representation under the common law, under the English common law. And when you get to the American Revolution, it finally pushes itself so much, and there has been enough time of these people being in the New World to where they consider themselves to be a different people. They consider themselves to be Americans or Yankees, or Americans, Virginians, Pinnites, Massachusettsites, Vermonters, and so forth, and Georgians. And they have come to, by this point, that is 1775, as being a separate people, and they opted to form their own government based upon popular consent, popular and common consent of the governed, to form a government. And the result of this is the British and their German Hessian allies invade the United States in 1776 and begin about a 7-year-long war, the American War of Independence, where the British actually do invade almost all of the states on the eastern seaboard. British ships and sailors raid and attack American ports. There is embargoes and blockades that are put into place to where other Europeans cannot trade with the rebelling American colonies. And the Americans, under pressure, are forced to sign the Declaration of Independence. They are forced to sign the various founding documents. And while at the beginning they did not really see themselves as a different people, ultimately they did come to view themselves as a separate people, and they were not English or British anymore, nor were they subjects of the crown or subjects of the king, but were now by popular consent or populist consent citizens of the New World. And so the British Empire would be the next major geostrategic enemy of the United States. The British invaded the United States in the American Revolution, and they did various raidings, burning, and ransacking. And the result is the British were defeated at Yorktown in Virginia, and the Treaty of Paris that was signed guaranteed the independence of the American states. The British invaded again in the War of 1812, 1811 to 1815. It ended with the Treaty of Ghent, and in what is now Belgium, by the way. And the British invaded with boots on the ground. They attacked into Maine, they attacked into Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan. They invaded Maryland and Louisiana and attacked, and they actually burned down Washington and ransacked the national capital. They also, I think, attacked Baltimore or raided Baltimore and went up the Chesapeake River, and they also tried to make a raid on New Orleans, but were defeated back or prevented from taking New Orleans. And had the British won, they probably would have taken a lot of the upper Midwest, probably would have taken some parts of Maine and Vermont or New Hampshire. But ultimately, the British were a bit more civil, and they decided to not take any land directly except in the Pacific Northwest, any territory of the United States. And from then on, there was a lot of rivalry, imperial rivalry between the United States and the United Kingdom. They were basically sort of these frenemies throughout the 19th century and into the early 20th century. But when the Second World War came around and the British were forced into a very bad position where they had no ability to defeat the Germans, and they were going to probably be invaded, and their empire was going to break up anyways, and they were on the verge of possible defeat, and they were just kind of hanging on. The British elites, the British ruling elites, finally consented to getting the Americans into the Second World War. And by doing this, by bringing the Americans into the war, the British got themselves very heavy into debt, and they were forced to give up their position as the hegemonic global or preponderant global power of the age. Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt signed the Atlantic Charter, and that was the end of the Pax Britannica. The British Empire grew to its largest global extent in about 1921, right after the First World War. And in the Second World War, the British were forced to cave in and call the Americans in, bring the Americans in. 90% of the American public did not want to go to war. They were against joining the war. And only the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor really changed American public minds and morale. And finally, the Americans did commit to the war. The British had their cities bombed out by the Germans. Their infrastructure was largely destroyed. The British merchant marine was largely preponderantly wiped out. And the British were under basically a 6-year-long blockade by Europe and by the rest of the world, and they had to resort to extreme rationing, processes of extreme rationing. And the result of this is that by the end of World War II, the British were bankrupt. The British government under Clement Attlee, who was the prime minister, was virtually bankrupt. And they were also trying to create a welfare state. And they needed to buy loans from the Americans or the British would become completely bankrupted. So they barely got through the Second World War. And the price that Great Britain had to pay was they had to give up their position and influence on the world. And they also had to give up their empire, which is what they did. India and Pakistan became independent, and not too long thereafter, Africa got independence. And so the British became billions and billions of dollars in debt. I think they were about $800 billion in debt to the Americans after the Second World War. And the British signed the Lend-Lease Bill and the Atlantic Charter, and America sent dreadnoughts and destroyers and cargo fleets and shipments to the UK. And they had to, in return for that, they had to let America use their Air Force bases, use their ports, their naval ports and air bases for American planes and shipping and stuff. They had to also cave in and not interfere anymore in the Western Hemisphere. And so that was the death knell of the British Empire. In fact, during the the Sinai Canal crisis, America almost sided with the Soviets against the British, French, and Israelis to drive the British out of Sinai. And so that was it. Like, after the Second World War, the Europeans were out of the Western Hemisphere. They had to abide by the Monroe Doctrine, and they were largely forced out. America was by then just too strong and powerful of an empire in its own right for any of the Europeans to contest with its predominance. So that's the United Kingdom. The next major threat to America's integrity as a state would be the Dominion of Canada. And Canada, it's usually seen that Canada and the United States have absolute friendly relations with each other. and Americans or Yankees and Canadians are always like real friendly, and the American-Canadian border is like always very stable and always has been. That's not the case. A lot of Empire loyalists and Tories went to Canada and settled in Ontario and like the Maritime provinces, and a lot of Canada's identity is its loyalty to the British Empire and to the British parliamentary model and to the king and the state church, the Anglican state church, and all of that. And in the early 19th century, of course, America invaded Quebec and Montreal in the War of Independence. America invaded Canada a couple of times in the War of 1812. But let's be fair, the Canadians invaded our territory in the War of 1812 as well. So it's actually a myth that Canadians and Yankees or Americans always got along. It's not always that clear cut. And during the height of the British Empire, the Canadians were very proud to be part of that group or that civilization and political system of the time. So if Canadians today roast in the shadow of American hegemony and largely cave in, during the time of British hegemony, the Canadians very much reveled in their participation in the British Empire system. But Canada has always had a much smaller population compared to the United States. Even though it has a bigger set of landmass and territory, it's largely empty, and it's very hard to defend the Canadian border, especially the southeastern Canadian border. And once the Americans built up a strong enough navy and really began to demonstrate and push its influence, there really wasn't much that Canadians could do to outright rival the United States. It would have been basically signing, it would have been the final nail in the coffin for Canada. So after about the Second World War, the Canadians more or less very much became very closely affiliated with and very close with Americans, and Canada was one of America's closest and best NATO allies in the Cold War, and Canada and the United States basically were on the same alliance side, and as far as they were concerned, they were now best buddies in the Cold War era. So, but in terms of Canadians invading and taking land from the United States, Canada has been by far the friendliest of America's geostrategic rivals, or, well, geo-neighbors, land-bordering neighbors. Now, the next one is Mexico. Mexico. And I could very easily get a lot of criticism for talking about this one. So I will have to tread lightly. I still have to point out and talk about the various truths and realities of the matter, but America's next geostrategic rival, at least in the 19th century, was Mexico. And it seems today that this could hardly be even realistic to even consider Mexico as a threat to the United States. Oh, how could the Federal Republic of Mexico, or the Federal Mexican States, as it's officially known by its constitution, how could Mexicans be a threat to the integrity of America, be it the Southwest or whatnot? Well, Mexico, of course, got its independence from Spain. The Spanish Empire, you have to remember that when the United States first became a country, the Spanish Empire covered all the land and territory from Arkansas and the Mississippi and about Missouri and Arkansas, bordering there west of the Mississippi, all the way down to Alabama, all the way to California and to California, all the way down to Patagonia. The Spanish Empire in the Americas was huge. But in 1823, Mexico got its independence from Spain. And Mexico, of course, the American population was a lot larger than Mexico's. And America has always had about 3 times or 4 times the number of population relative to Mexico's. And so the first major threat, or the first major geostrategic threat to the integrity of the United States from Mexico was the Texican Rebellion. And it was a rebellion. American settlers, southern settlers going into Mexican Tejas and Coahuila, the province of Tejas and Coahuila, they did go in there and they did bring their slaves, and slavery was outlawed in the territory of Mexico, and they did incite rebellion with every bit the intention to annex that territory from Mexico, as well as other areas in the future in the western United States, and take it from Mexico. You know, as far back as the 1810s, possibly even the 1790s, there were designs and ideas of the Americans to take all the territory out to the Pacific and the Caribbean. And so there was already designs to take Texas and California. Very early on in America's history has a republic, has an independent republic. Anyways, the Texas or the Texican revolt against Mexico, which Mexico was under, they would not have called it a dictatorship, but they would have said that it was a federational government. So the Mexican government was a 3-branch government. It had a Senate, a Congress, it had the basic republican structures and the 3 main branches of government. It was an Enlightenment influenced government, but anyways, they were under the presidency, and Santa Anna, basically, he abrogated the Constitution to make himself president for a huge number of years, and so the Texians regarded this as a dictator. He was regarded as a tyrant, a Nero-like tyrant and dictator, and he was trying to oppress them. He was trying to take away their property rights, their individual rights, concerns about land and freedom of religion, concerns about the freedom to practice their Protestant religion. This and a host of other matters triggered the Texican Rebellion or the Texican Revolt, otherwise known as the Texian War of Independence or the Texian Revolution. And the end result of this was, even though the Texians were greatly outnumbered, they defeated the Mexicans and won this revolution, and Mexico Texas or Tejas became its own republic for a period of 9 years. And then in 1845, it was annexed into the United States. And also at the same time, American settlers were going to California, where the Bear Flag Rebellion would take place. Americans were going to Oregon, to Washington, to Utah, to Nevada, to California. There was talks and discussions about California succeeding at this time as well. And Mexico was not at all happy about this. And make no mistake, from the very first day of the Texas Rebellion, there was always a desire of the Texans to join the United States. Anyone that tells you any differently that Texas did not choose to join the United States until later is lying to your face. They are lying straight to your face. But regardless, between the Texas Revolution and the Mexican-American War, there were fears by Americans, especially during the Texican Rebellion, that Mexican troops and Mexican soldiers were not only planning to suppress the Texican revolt, but they were going to invade American territory and take New Orleans. There was actually fears that Mexico was going to invade the territory of the Midwestern United States and take land and territory from Ohio to Alabama or to Louisiana. And that they were going to take all the land west of the Mississippi River. Now, Mexico did not have the manpower, and it did not have the integrity or the internal unity to actually pull something like that off. Anyways, California, Mexican California, Altai Californias rebelled against Mexico in the Bear Flag Revolt and declared itself the Californian Republic. And not even a year later, American sailors and soldiers invaded Los Angeles and San Francisco and occupied and annexed California. Texas joined the United States. Americans were settling in Utah and Nevada as well, and were going to New Mexico. And already, even before the Mexican-American War happened, Americans were already settling that far west. And so naturally, the Mexican-American War broke out over contention and disputes over the Rio Grande River and the land and territory of the Rio Grande, as well as other border contentions between the United States and the Mexican federal states. The result was the 2.5-year-long American-Mexican War, and of course, America crushed the Mexicans. And the result of this was the Treaty of Hidalgo, Guadalupe Hidalgo, and the Gadsden Purchase. And with the territory gained in the American Southwest and the Northwest Pacific as well, afterwards it was going to be impossible, absolutely utterly impossible, for a land-based power to invade the United States and directly contend and challenge the land integrity of the 48 states after this point. Now, during the 1910s, there was the Mexican border war, in which some American soldiers invaded Mexico under John J. Pershing, and there were some raids by Pancho Villa into the American Southwest. This is different in nature, in the sense that the Mexicans were not trying to really reclaim American territory. There was the Zimmerman telegram in 1917 that said or claimed that Germany would support Mexico reclaiming the Southwest United States or its territory and take it back, but the Mexicans were not going to be able to do it. They were going through a revolution they were going through a civil war, and they were too busy fighting each other with the Sandinistas and all of that to actually threaten the United States directly. Also, Mexico had no agreement or no treaty with the Central Powers. And then in the later 20th century, there has been the war on drugs, and American mercenaries, American troopers, and American Border Patrol going into Mexico and fighting the drug cartels and all of this. But again, most of the contention between Mexico and the United States has been because of that southern border. It has not always been the most peaceful or stable border. It certainly is not like the Canadian-U.S. border, but overall, since the U.S.-Mexican War of 1846 to 1848, and especially the Gadsden Purchase in 1854, that border has more or less remained very stable. Now, while this probably would not be seen as a national rival or a national geostrategic issue, the Confederate States of America, or the Confederacy, was technically its own independent nation from 1861 to 1865, and there were some raids and invasions and interventions, especially Robert E. Lee's Army of Virginia, or the General Army of Virginia, and some other Confederate raids into Missouri, especially southern and central Missouri, and in raids into Ohio and Indiana and so on. But the South was more similar culturally with the Yankees or the North than they were to any other country. And overwhelmingly, the Confederacy was not necessarily a geostrategic enemy, but it was one of more of internal dissension and internal rivalry and issues that plagued the United States over problems and issues from the earliest colonial period down to the late antebellum period. The South became more enriched and more ingrained on gentrification and stratification within society, on slavery and chattel slavery. The North became more industrial and egalitarian and urban dwelling and literate and progressive overall in its design. And it also had a larger population and greater infrastructure. And the Confederacy was never going to amount to ever being truly its own true independent state. It was just too gentrified and too rustic and agrarian to actually, and Celtic, to actually pose a challenge or a threat. The moment that the South succeeded, its days were numbered as a nation. But anyways, with the defeat of the Confederacy and the crushing of the Confederacy, the United States in 1865, other than perhaps British-controlled Canada, had no direct national rivalry or geostrategic enemies. Now, with concern about the world wars and about Germany, the threat of Germany or the threat of Japan, Germany and Japan are in Europe and the Far East, respectively, and they were never, even in their wildest dreams or imaginations, ever going to actually invade up front any of the territory and lands of the United States. At the worst, at the absolute worst, the Germans could have attacked the U.S. Virgin Islands in the Caribbean. The Germans could have perhaps attacked the Florida Keys, but the Germans were never going to actually invade or go on the eastern coast, the American East Coast. it was just never going to happen. The Germans did not have the navy, they did not have the manpower or the infrastructure to fight a protracted land war with the United States, separated by the Atlantic. Similarly, the Japanese, at the absolute worst, the Japanese could have attacked the Aleutian Islands. They could have attacked some parts of the West Coast. They could have made some submarine raids into Los Angeles, California, or into Dutch Harbor, Alaska, or Seattle, Washington. Or they could have perhaps made an amphibious assault on the Hawaiian Islands, or take American Samoa. But at the absolute worst case scenario, Japan was never going to be a geostrategic threat to the United States except in the Pacific Ocean. Likewise with Germany in the Atlantic. The Germans and the Japanese were never going to be able to match the United States in terms of manpower, raw material outtake, mineral and raw material outflow, etc. So it just wasn't going to happen. And also, once the U.S. Civil War ended and stuff, the North and the South realigned, and ultimately the Northern and Southern states came to see themselves as far more similar than different, and they opted to grow together in one nation or in one grand union, as opposed to being fighting at different ends or on different opposing sides. And so the southern states were always going to see themselves as part of the same nation as the northern states. And so likewise, there was not going to be any more of a southern threat. So all that stuff taken into account, the next major geo-rival or geostrategic rival of the United States was the Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, with the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic has the main contingent block or land contingent zone of the Soviet Union. Once the Soviets got a hold of nuclear or thermonuclear weapons and were first able to explode an atomic bomb or a helium bomb, and then later got a hold of technology to explode a hydrogen bomb, and once they were able to build an air force and ICBMs that could reach the North American continent, especially by way of Alaska and the Arctic Shield, the Soviet Union became probably what has been up to this date, the most threatening, largest direct geostrategic threat to the existence and the national security of the United States. And for 47 years, from 1947 to about 1990, the Americans and the Soviets aimed ICBMs and destructive thermonuclear warheads at each other under a policy of mutually assured destruction. The Americans and the Soviets also directly rivaled and tried to gag at each other in the space race to try to build operational space-propelled satellites and satellite weather stations and satellite spy satellites and radio telekinetic networks in space, in terms of actually guiding those ICBMs in mutually assured destruction. And so the Soviet Union, even though it's in northern Eurasia, became perhaps to date the greatest threat to the integrity of the United States. And then there was the I-2 spy plane incident, where an American spy plane in 1960, 1961 violated Soviet space and was shot down, and it became an international contention. There was the Berlin blockade in 1947, Cuban Missile Crisis of 1961, when the Russians tried to install rockets and thermonuclear weapons into Cuba, and America tried to install weapons and nukes into Turkey. And then there was issues and stuff like in 1982, 1983, there was a strategic threat or strategic threats in regards to computers branding off each other. And there was actually some computer or IBM computer actually came within just mere minutes of calculating that the Russians were going to fire nukes into the United States, but nothing happened out of it. So lots of struggles. And so in 1986-87, with the Reykjavik Treaty that was signed, for the first time in the Cold War, the Americans and the Soviets agreed to limit their the number of rockets and thermonuclear weapons that they had stockpiled and basically targeting and ready to make an attack into either NATO or Warsaw Pact territory or so on and so forth. There is, of course, a very strong ideological and cultural and perhaps even spiritual difference between the Americans and the Soviets. The Americans were largely Christian, very religious and theist, at least, and theist. Americans were overwhelmingly religious. The Russians were atheists. They did not believe in God. The Communist Party taught that there was no God, that there was a evolution of the modes of production and the value of labor theory, and there was no God in the Soviet Union. It considered itself to be an atheistic nation, so most Soviets were atheists. Americans were capitalists. They believed in a free market and in free enterprise and the value of exchange rates and trade. The Soviets believed in a state co-op run economy. They were communists. They followed dialectical materialism or the dialectical precept. And so there is a lot of this Christianity versus atheism, capitalism versus communism, and the menace of communist atheism, and a lot of propaganda and fear about it. And a lot of it was really deranged. To be honest, a lot of it was fake and made up. But it was the Cold War. It was the 1950s, and people were very scared. So from about 1950 to about 1990, the United States was, as well as other NATO countries, was almost always under this constant umbrella of fear of a nuclear war or a nuclear apocalypse. Now, with regards to the end of America's rivalry with Mexico, in the 1980s under Reagan, the NAFTA treaty was signed, and this created an open economic zone between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, a free economic zone. And this pretty much ended Mexico's claims to the American Southwest, as well as American claims to further Mexican territory and Canadian territory as well. So the NAFTA Accords finally ended the security threat with Mexico. Although under the second Trump administration, NAFTA has been reversed, and I guess we're now back to The United States and Mexico are nation states, separate nations. They have a closed border. America and Mexico got to protect their border. So I guess that's, we've shifted away from that neoliberal globalist mindset of the 1990s. In 1991, concerning the American-Soviet rivalry and the geostrategic threat of the Soviets, in 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. A treaty between the various Soviet socialist republics was signed. There was some backlash by the Soviet Communist Party, but it failed, and the republics opted to push and declare independence. And so the result was that the Soviet Union dissolved, and the Russian Federation was much, much substantially weaker and would have never been able to rival the United States on a geostrategic scale as the Soviet Union had previously done. And also, the Warsaw Pact dissolved and most of its members joined NATO and the EU. So, that Western extension and outreach that the Soviets had was no longer there. And in the 1990s, there is this push to remodel Russia to be like a Western country. Now, in hindsight, this did not happen. Vladimir Putin reversed policy from being a moderate Westernizer, and Russia has again become a very strong rival of the US geopolitically, but Russia does not have the manpower, the weapons, nor the capabilities to directly threaten the United States. It is not like the Soviet Union of 1970, not even close to it. And its population, Russia's population, is going down the toilet fast. Now, at present, there isn't an actual single nation or country that could rival or match the United States, per se. The European Union, which is not a country itself, but a block of nations working and operating in an economic free trade zone, tariff-free trade zone, in a federation parliamental system centered at Brussels, the European Union could rise as a potential candidate to rival the United States, but it doesn't have the military arsenal or the weapons or forces to actually compete with the United States militarily. The People's Republic of China could be another geostrategic rival, but the Chinese have a lot of inter-ethnic problems. There is problems with a very bad infrastructure in the People's Republic of China. They do have the manpower. They're over 1 billion people, so they do have the manpower. They have a far bigger number of people than the United States has. And they do have something of an army and armed forces that could directly challenge the United States. And the Chinese economy is really huge as well, but they only have like 1 or 2 aircraft carriers. The United States has like 50 operational aircraft carriers. America completely outflanks China in the number of ports and like thoroughfare and control in the South China Seas, completely dominated by the U.S. Navy militarily. And the Chinese, outside of their coastlines, don't really have that much of a naval presence. Their air capabilities and their rocket and nuclear capabilities are actually very limited, and their nuclear stock is very limited. So perhaps the only thing the Chinese could threaten the United States is they could take some American Pacific islands. Maybe they could fire or launch nuclear missiles on the West United States coast, but that is extremely unlikely to happen. And the Chinese don't really spread like propaganda that they're going to go to war with America or they're going to nuke America. They really don't do that. They instead focus more on the Road and Belt Initiative. They kind of focus more on trade and exchange with the developing world and building influence in Africa. So what the Chinese do instead is they push for soft power influence. The Chinese are trying to sign relationship agreements, trade agreements, economic agreements with different Latin American states. And they've done a very good job since Trump has come back into office. And really for the last 8 or so years, the last 10 years, the Chinese have really grown their capital investments and their business investments and outreach, basically soft power into different Latin American states to the point where they're basically in America's back door through Latin America and through the Caribbean. The Chinese have also made friendly relations with Serbia, Mexico, some of Southeast Asia and East Africa. Kenya and Uganda are relatively on friendly relations with the Chinese. And the Chinese will try to go into those countries and push out American business interests, push out American capital, replace it with a BRICS or Chinese capital, and so forth. And so, as of 2025, America does not have any one nation, land, naval, or air or space-based nation that could directly threaten its internal security. As such, the Chinese could prove to be a potential rival geostrategically in some of the developing world, but the People's Republic of China is not really a threat to the United States. The Russian Federation is also not really a threat to American internal security either. If anything, they're far more of a threat to Europe than they are to North America. So North America is in a very free and unique position. It is very well protected by coastline and by giant oceans. Virtually all the countries in the Western Hemisphere are too weak to directly challenge the United States. And so anyways, that is my breakdown. That's my personal breakdown of American geostrategy. At different times, Spain, France, Great Britain, Canada, Mexico, the Confederacy, but only has an internal rebellion only has an internalized revolt, and the Soviet Union have been the main direct threats to the internal security and internal protection of the American United States or the United States of America. Otherwise, America, in its very brief 250 years of existence, hasn't really had a direct land threat to its shores. So that's my breakdown of American geostrategy. I hope you enjoyed it. I recommend that you watch Peter Zeihan. Peter Zeihan is a good source for a lot of this. Rick Perry in the chat says, Forge Gang! banging for life. Woo! All right. So, anyways, in the near future, America will probably remain the only superpower, but it will continue to face external challenges from developing nations. So, I am your host, Imperator of Forge, otherwise known as Forge Warhammer. Thank you so much for watching. This is it. Forge Gang! I am still a hard man! Stay hard! Bye for now.